Have you ever wondered what it was truly like to feel the bone-deep chill of a world before central heating, a world lit only by fire and gaslight? We often view the Victorian winter through a romantic haze of Christmas cards and festive tales, but tonight we are going to step past that illusion and into the reality of a London street as the first snowflakes of the season begin to fall. As we begin our journey together, I'm always so curious to know where in the world this story is finding you and what time it is in your corner of the globe. Please feel free to share in the comments below. It's wonderful to imagine our community of listeners scattered across the night. For now, find a comfortable position, allow your body to relax, and let our story begin. Welcome to Sleeping Scribe, where calming history stories help you unwind and gently fall asleep. Tonight, we journey back to the 19th century to feel what it was really like to survive a winter that was both a beautiful spectacle and a formidable foe. Our story starts not with the cold itself, but with the warm, glowing image of it that has been passed down through the ages. The picture we hold in our minds is often one of pure enchantment. It is a world painted by the warm and generous prose of Charles Dickens, a vision of winter that is less about survival and more about celebration. This is the Dickensian dream, a carefully constructed fantasy of festive cheer that has become our default memory of a time long past. Imagine a London street, gaslights casting a gentle golden glow upon cobblestones freshly dusted with a layer of brilliant white snow. The air is crisp, and it stings your cheeks in a way that feels invigorating, alive. And so, through this idealized lens, we see bustling markets, their stalls groaning under the weight of festive goods. The warm, spicy smell of mulled wine and roasting chestnuts wafts from a street vendor's cart, the steam rising in thick, fragrant clouds that mingle with the cold air. You can almost hear the gentle murmur of the crowd, punctuated by the cheerful shouts of merchants and the distant, melodic voices of carolers, their songs slightly muffled by the softly falling snow. It is a symphony of sensory delight, a perfect moment captured in time. In fact, this entire vision was powerfully shaped by events that unfolded in a very short span of time. In 1843, a man named Sir Henry Cole, a senior civil servant who was instrumental in establishing the modern postal system, found himself too busy to write personal holiday letters. He commissioned an artist, John Calcott Horsley, to design a card he could send instead. The illustration depicted a family toasting with wine, flanked by scenes of charity. 1,000 of these cards were printed, and the first commercial Christmas card was born, creating a new tradition and a new way to visualize the season's greetings. That very same year, Charles Dickens published his timeless novella, A Christmas Carol. More than just a story, it was a powerful piece of social commentary that redefined the modern idea of Christmas. It emphasized family, charity, and goodwill, weaving these themes into a narrative of magical transformation. The story was an instant success, and its vision of a joyous, forgiving, and festive Christmas season became deeply embedded in the public consciousness, shaping how the holiday was celebrated and perceived for generations to come. But this cultural shift was not limited to literature and stationery. 5 years later, in 1848, the wider British public was given a new icon for their festive celebrations. The Illustrated London News, a popular periodical of the day, published a detailed engraving. It showed the beloved Queen Victoria, her German consort Prince Albert, and their children gathered around a beautifully decorated evergreen tree inside Windsor Castle. While the tradition of bringing a tree indoors was known in German culture, this single image of the royal family popularized the Christmas tree in Britain and America with astonishing speed. It became a must-have centerpiece for the holiday home. And then there was the music. Caroling, a tradition with roots stretching back centuries, experienced a massive revival during the Victorian era. It moved from the church into the streets and homes of ordinary people. Many of the carols we still sing today, the ones that instantly evoke the feeling of the season, were either written or gained immense popularity during this period. The sound of voices joined in song, echoing through the cold night air, became an inseparable part of the winter soundscape. And so, the season began to take on a more official structure. The Boxing Day holiday, celebrated on the day after Christmas, was formally recognized with the Bank Holidays Act of 1871. This act solidified a period of festive rest and leisure, giving official sanction to a time of year that was increasingly becoming a cornerstone of the national calendar. It was a time for family, for games, and for recovering from the feasting of the day before. The iconic image of skaters gliding gracefully across frozen ponds was also a common and cherished reality of the Victorian winter. In an era before artificial ice rinks, the cold was a necessary partner for this popular pastime. Public parks would often intentionally flood fields and meadows as the temperatures dropped, creating vast open-air skating rinks for the public. These frozen expanses became social hubs, filled with the sight of elegantly dressed men and women, and the sound of laughter and scraping blades. Of course, no festive scene would be complete without the tastes and smells of the season. Victorian Christmas markets were a feast for the senses, offering all manner of treats to ward off the chill. Vendors sold paper cones filled with hot roasted chestnuts, fragrant gingerbread fresh from the oven, and, for the adults, steaming cups of hot gin punch, a potent and warming concoction of gin, sugar, lemon, and spices. These simple pleasures were an essential part of the public celebration of winter. These idealized scenes were not just confined to the streets of London. They were broadcast to a mass audience through the burgeoning print media. Illustrated magazines, chief among them the Illustrated London News, played a crucial role in creating and disseminating this romantic vision of winter. Their detailed engravings depicted families gathered around the hearth, sleigh rides through the countryside, and snow-covered cityscapes, creating a shared visual language for the season that could be enjoyed by people in every corner of the country. And for entertainment, families of all classes flocked to the theater for the Christmas pantomime. This uniquely British tradition, with its mix of comedy, fairy tales, and audience participation, became a hugely popular form of holiday entertainment. It was a world of pure escapism, a warm and brightly lit refuge from the cold and dark of the winter months, filled with laughter and spectacle. Finally, the simple act of sending a greeting was revolutionized. The expansion of the postal service during the Victorian era was a marvel of modern logistics. This new efficiency made it possible for the mass exchange of the newly popular Christmas cards and letters. Families and friends, separated by distance, could now share in the festive spirit. Their handwritten sentiments carried across the snow-dusted country, reinforcing the bonds of community and affection. The sight of elaborate, hand-painted Christmas cards displayed proudly on a mantelpiece became a new and beloved decorative tradition. But this beautiful, heartwarming picture was only a sliver of the truth. For the vast majority, the reality that lay beneath this festive veneer was far colder and more challenging. Behind the closed doors of the picturesque, snow-dusted homes, an unseen enemy was always waiting. It was a constant, silent, and invisible antagonist. It was the cold itself. In a world without central heating, without modern insulation, the cold was not something that stayed outside. It lived in the house with you. Imagine a home built not for comfort, but for appearance. The hallmark of Victorian architecture, the elegant sash window, was also a primary source of drafts. These windows, with their sliding vertical panels, rarely formed a perfect seal. Even when closed, a persistent, tiny river of icy air would find its way through the gaps between the wood and the frame, a constant reminder of the world outside. You could often hear the faint, mournful whistling sound of the wind as it seeped into the room. The very walls of the house were conduits for the cold. Most homes were built with solid brick walls, with no cavity or space for insulation as we know it today. This dense brickwork would absorb the winter chill, slowly radiating it inward. The walls themselves became cold to the touch, and they would leach warmth out of any room, making it a constant battle to maintain even a modest level of comfort. And it was not just the windows and walls. The cold found countless other ways to invade the home. It crept through the gaps under doors, through the spaces between floorboards, and around ill-fitting window frames. These were not minor annoyances. They were significant sources of heat loss that made entire sections of a house feel almost as cold as the outdoors. The feeling of an icy cold floorboard through a thin rug was a familiar morning shock for many. This meant that the very concept of a stable indoor temperature did not exist. The temperature could vary wildly from one room to the next, and even within the same room. To be near the fire was to be warm, but to move 10 feet away was to enter a different climate zone entirely. A hallway or staircase could feel shockingly cold, and you would often see your own breath misting in the air as you moved from one part of the house to another. To combat this relentless infiltration, households relied on simple, often handmade solutions. Draft excluders were an essential piece of household equipment. These were typically sausage-shaped tubes of fabric, stuffed with sand, sawdust, or scraps of cloth, and laid carefully at the bottom of doors to block the chilly airflow. Every door leading to a hallway or an unheated room would have one as a silent sentinel against the cold. In the coldest spells, it was not uncommon for ice to form on the inside of windows. The moisture from people's breath and daily activities like cooking would condense on the frigid glass panes and freeze overnight, creating beautiful but unsettling patterns of frost. Waking up to find a delicate, icy filigree on your bedroom window was a clear sign that the unseen enemy had tightened its grip on the house. This was especially true in the bedrooms, which were almost always unheated. The cost of fuel meant that fires were typically lit only in the main living areas, like the parlor or the kitchen. This made the act of going to bed a genuinely shocking experience. The sheets would feel stiff and icy cold, and it would take a long time for body heat alone to create a small pocket of warmth beneath the heavy blankets. Ironically, a prevailing medical belief of the time often made the problem worse. Many Victorians feared the effects of night air, believing it to be a source of illness and disease. Consequently, they would often keep bedroom windows sealed shut throughout the winter. This lack of ventilation combined with the dampness that pervaded many homes, created a stuffy, chilly, and unhealthy indoor environment. You could often detect the musty smell of dampness lingering in these poorly ventilated rooms. The lower levels of the house were often the coldest and dampest. Basements and cellars, which were frequently used as kitchens or as living quarters for servants, were notoriously uncomfortable. Being partly or wholly underground, they were in constant contact with the cold, moist earth. The chill in these spaces was a deep, penetrating cold that seemed to settle in the very bones. And this was compounded by the phenomenon of rising damp, a constant battle in Victorian construction. Without modern damp-proof courses, moisture from the ground would slowly wick its way up through the porous brickwork of the foundations and walls. This made rooms feel perpetually clammy and cold, and it could lead to peeling wallpaper, rotting floorboards, and a persistent, unhealthy environment. In this constant state of siege, a sudden draft could cause a candle flame to flicker wildly, a tiny, dramatic illustration of the invisible forces at play. In this constant war against the cold, there was one primary fortress, one bastion of warmth that served as the absolute center of domestic life: the hearth. The fireplace was more than just a source of heat. It was the heart of the home, the gravitational center around which all daily activity orbited. It was where meals were cooked, where families gathered to talk and read, and where the only reliable warmth in the entire house could be found. The fuel that fed these hearts of the home was not the romantic crackling wood of a country cottage. In a sprawling metropolis like London, the primary fuel was coal. It was plentiful and relatively cheap, and it burned with a powerful, intense heat. But this heat came at a cost. Coal smoke was thick, acrid, and dirty, leaving a fine layer of soot on every surface and filling the air with a sharp sulfuric smell that would catch in the back of your throat. The sheer quantity of coal required to get through a winter was staggering. A typical middle-class London home, with fires lit in perhaps 2 or 3 rooms, could easily burn through several tons of coal in a single season. This fuel had to be purchased, delivered, and then stored, usually in a dark cellar or coal hole. Managing the supply was a constant domestic concern, a significant item in the household budget, and the daily ritual of the fire was one of relentless, arduous labor. Long before the family awoke, a servant, or, in more modest homes, the woman of the house, would descend to the cold, dark rooms. Their first task was to clean out the grate, scooping out the ash and cinders from the previous day's fire. Then, they would have to carefully build a new one, using paper, kindling, and lumps of coal, coaxing it to life. This was a messy, physically demanding job that had to be repeated every single day. Over time, the chimneys would become choked with a thick, flammable layer of soot. This posed a serious fire risk and reduced the efficiency of the chimney's draw. To solve this, chimney sweeps were employed. This dangerous and unpleasant job was often performed by small children, young boys who were forced to climb up into the narrow, dark, and suffocating confines of the chimney to scrape the soot away. What's more, the fireplace was a remarkably inefficient way to heat a room. Scientific principles of thermodynamics were not a consideration in domestic design. Most of the heat generated by the burning coals did not enter the room. Instead, it went straight up the chimney, lost to the outside air. The warmth that people actually felt was radiant heat, which only warmed the small area directly in front of the grate, leaving the rest of the room largely untouched. This created a strange microclimate around the hearth. To sit too close was to be scorched by the intense, direct heat. To sit too far away was to feel the chill of the room. This is why fire screens were essential pieces of furniture. These decorative panels, often beautifully embroidered or painted, were not just for show. They were used to shield a person's face and clothes from the fierce heat and to protect against the danger of flying sparks. The area around the fireplace, the chimney-piece or mantelpiece, naturally became the focal point of the room. It was a stage for displaying the family's most prized possessions: clocks, vases, figurines, and portraits. Its prominence was a direct reflection of the hearth's central importance in domestic life. It was a symbol of status, a curated display of the family's taste and prosperity, all centered around their single source of life-giving warmth. But this warmth came with a constant and very real danger. The open flames of the fireplace were a huge fire hazard in a home filled with flammable Victorian textiles, heavy woolen curtains, upholstered furniture, voluminous dresses with layers of petticoats, and even the newspapers people read by the fire could all be ignited by a single stray spark. The rhythmic crackle and pop of the burning coals in the grate was a comforting sound, but it was also a reminder of the destructive power that lay at the heart of the home. The logistics of keeping the fire fed were also part of the daily routine. Coal was not stored next to the fireplace. It had to be fetched from the cellar or coal shed, a task that was repeated multiple times a day. Heavy metal buckets, known as coal scuttles or hods, were used to carry the dusty, black lumps up from the depths of the house. It was another piece of the unending labor required to keep the small circle of warmth alive, and the quality of the fire itself was a subject of endless domestic preoccupation. Was it burning too quickly, wasting precious fuel? Was it giving off enough heat? Was the coal of good quality, or was it producing too much smoke and ash? The management of the fire was a skill, and its success or failure had a direct impact on the comfort and well-being of the entire household. The orange glow of the fire, reflecting on the faces of those gathered around it, was a sight of pure comfort, but it was a comfort that had to be earned every single day. The faint taste of soot and ash seemed to lightly coat everything in the room, a constant reminder of the home's reliance on its dirty, powerful heart. With this small island of warmth established, the family could only wait and watch as the world outside underwent its own profound and challenging transformation. The arrival of the first significant winter storm was not just a change in the weather. It was an event that altered the very fabric of city life. The transformation began with sound. As the first thick flakes of snow began to fall, a profound, almost magical quiet would descend upon the city. This was a London whose normal soundtrack was a constant cacophony. The sharp clatter of thousands of horses' hooves on stone, the loud rumble of ironclad carriage wheels, the cries of street vendors, and the general din of 1,000,000 people living in close quarters. But snow was a great insulator. It absorbed sound, blanketing the city in a sudden and unfamiliar peace. The clatter of hooves changed to a dull, rhythmic thud on the packed snow, and the rumble of wheels was muffled into a distant whisper. The only sharp sound that remained was the satisfying crunch of your own footsteps in the pristine, early morning snow. The light changed to, on a gray winter day, the sky would already be a uniformed sheet of dull white, but falling snow seemed to diffuse the light further, making it softer and more ethereal. This effect was magnified by the infamous London fogs. These were not gentle mists. They were a thick mixture of natural water vapor and the dense, yellow-brown smoke from countless coal fires. Known as pea-soupers, these fogs could reduce visibility to a matter of feet, turning midday into a murky twilight. The gas street lamps, which normally cast pools of clear light, now created eerie, diffuse halos in the thick, swirling fog and snow. And the very ground beneath one's feet became treacherous. Snow was not cleared from the streets with any modern efficiency. Instead, it was quickly packed down by the endless traffic of horses and carts, turning into a dirty, slippery layer of ice and slush. The pristine white blanket would quickly become stained with soot, mud, and horse manure, creating a gritty, wet mess that clung to boots and the hems of long skirts and trousers. To navigate this hazardous landscape, a new, informal economy would spring up. Street orderlies or crossing sweepers, often desperately poor children, would station themselves at busy intersections. Armed with a rough broom, they would sweep a clean path across the muddy, snowy street for pedestrians in exchange for a halfpenny, for a lady in a fine dress or a gentleman in polished shoes. This small service was essential for getting around the city with any degree of cleanliness. In the most severe winters, the city's main artery, the River Thames, could be brought to a complete standstill. The river would occasionally freeze over completely, trapping ships in the ice and halting all traffic of goods and people. This was a rare but dramatic event that served as a powerful reminder of winter's ability to paralyze even the largest and most powerful city in the world. The cold also launched a direct assault on the city's basic infrastructure. Water pipes in the Victorian era were often made of lead and were laid in shallow trenches without adequate protection from the frost. As the ground froze solid, these pipes would frequently freeze and burst. This would cut off the water supply to entire neighborhoods, making daily life even more difficult. It was a crisis that could leave homes without water for drinking, cooking, or washing for days on end. The challenges of transportation had an immediate and serious impact on the city's economy. The horse-drawn omnibuses and private carriages that served as public transport would struggle on the icy streets. Heavy snowfall could make some roads completely impassable, isolating neighborhoods and making it impossible for people to get to work. Horses would slip and fall, and vehicles would get stuck, creating massive log jams. And this disruption to transport had a direct effect on the price of essential goods. As roads and rivers became impassable, it became harder to bring food and fuel into the city. Within days of a heavy storm, the price of coal, bread, and vegetables would begin to rise. For the city's middle classes, this was an inconvenience. But for the vast population of the poor, a sudden spike in prices could be a catastrophe. For the thousands of people who were homeless or lived in extreme poverty, the first heavy snowfall was not a beautiful sight. It was a life-threatening emergency. Without adequate shelter, clothing, or food, the onset of a truly bitter cold was a brutal and often fatal event. For them, the romantic image of the Victorian winter was a cruel fiction. Their reality was a desperate struggle for survival against an enemy that offered no mercy. The smell of wet wool coats and damp leather was a common scent, as people would crowd into any available shop or public house simply to escape the biting cold for a few precious moments. The city was now a different world. one that demanded new routines and a relentless focus on a single daily goal: the battle for warmth. The ingenuity required to simply live in this era of invention and struggle is truly fascinating. If this glimpse into their world sparks your curiosity, what other historical periods or aspects of daily life would you love for us to explore together in a future story? Thinking about your suggestions helps us create more of what you love, and we're always grateful for your ideas. Now, let us continue our journey into the heart of the Victorian home in winter. In the perpetual twilight of a Victorian winter morning, the first battle of the day began the moment one's feet touched the floor. It was a silent, personal struggle, waged not with weapons, but with wool and flannel. Before the hearth could spread its meager circle of influence, a person's only defense against the biting cold of an unheated bedroom was the armor they wore. Clothing was not merely fashion, it was a primary form of personal heating, a fortress of fabric against an ever-present siege. For the inhabitants of this era, dressing was a ritual of layering. Consider a middle-class woman preparing for the day. Her first layer would be a chemise of linen or cotton, followed by long drawers. Over this came the formidable corset, a rigid structure of whalebone and steel that, while shaping the figure, offered no warmth at all. Then came the petticoats, not one, but several. One or two might be of flannel for insulation, with more layers of starched cotton on top to create the fashionable bell-shaped silhouette. The sheer weight of these garments was immense, a heavy burden carried throughout the day. Only after this foundation was complete would she don her main dress, likely made of a heavy, dense wool. Indeed, wool was the undisputed king of winter fabrics. It was a miraculous material in an age of natural fibers. Its crimped, resilient fibers trapped air, creating a natural layer of insulation that kept body heat in and the cold out. It was used for everything imaginable. Woolen undergarments, though often scratchy, provided a vital base layer. Woolen stockings were essential. And of course, the heavy outer coats, suits, and dresses were almost universally made from this versatile material. The slightly scratchy feeling of a heavy wool coat collar against your neck was a constant, tactile reminder of your defense against the elements. Flannel, a soft woven fabric typically made from wool, was another key weapon in the arsenal. Its brushed, fluffy texture was particularly good at trapping heat, making it the preferred material for winter nightgowns, dressing gowns, and the undergarments of those who could afford its relative softness. To slip into a flannel nightgown was a small but profound luxury, a moment of comfort before braving the icy sheets of the bed. And what of the men? Their attire was similarly constructed around the principle of layering. A man would wear a shirt and drawers, often of wool or a wool-cotton blend. Over this, a waistcoat or vest was absolutely essential. This single, sleeveless garment provided an extra layer of insulation for the core of the body, a critical zone for maintaining overall warmth. His suit would be cut from heavy tweed or serge, thick woolen fabrics designed for durability and heat retention. But the defining garment for a man in winter was his overcoat. This was not a light jacket, it was a greatcoat, a truly substantial piece of outerwear, often stretching down to the ankles. Made of the heaviest possible wool, sometimes with a dense lining, it was a walking shelter. To turn up the collar of a greatcoat and venture out into a snowy street was to carry your own small pocket of warmth with you. The smell of damp wool drying by the fire was one of the most common and pervasive scents of a Victorian winter household. For the wealthy, this battle for warmth could be fought with luxurious and beautiful ammunition. Fur, the ultimate insulator, was a clear and potent symbol of status. Women's coats would be trimmed with cuffs and collars of mink or fox. They would carry fur muffs to keep their hands warm, a far more effective solution than simple gloves. For the truly affluent, a full coat of beaver or sealskin was the pinnacle of winter fashion, a statement of wealth that was as practical as it was extravagant. Even footwear had its own specialized defenses. In the muddy, slushy streets, protecting one's shoes and ankles was a constant concern. This led to the popularity of spats, or spatterdashes. These were fabric coverings, usually of felt or canvas, that buttoned around the ankle and over the top of the shoe, forming a protective barrier against the wet and grime of the street. But what about the youngest members of society? Children were often bundled in so many layers that their movement was severely restricted. A small child might be dressed in so many woolen undershirts, petticoats, and coats that they resembled a small, walking bundle of fabric, their arms held stiffly at their sides. For infants, this practice was a form of swaddling, wrapping them tightly in blankets to conserve every last bit of precious body heat. Amidst all this, one domestic skill became more important than ever: knitting. The craft saw a massive surge in popularity during the Victorian era. It was a productive and respectable pastime for women of all classes. It allowed them to transform skeins of wool into essential items for the whole family. The sight of intricate knitted patterns on a pair of gloves, a thick shawl, or a pair of warm socks was a testament to a woman's skill and her contribution to the family's survival. The feeling of relief as you pulled on a thick pair of woolen socks on a cold morning was a small daily blessing. Of course, this entire picture of warmth and protection was a world away for the city's poor. They had no such arsenal. Their clothing was often made of shoddy, thin cotton, or repurposed materials scavenged from other uses. A coat might be a threadbare hand-me-down offering little protection. Shoes were often broken, with holes that let in the damp and cold. For them, wool was a luxury, and layering was a matter of putting on every single piece of ragged clothing they owned. Their experience of the cold was not one of discomfort, but of genuine, life-threatening peril. Once dressed, the next front in the battle against the cold was fought in the kitchen, where food became a source of both sustenance and vital internal warmth. The Victorian winter diet was a direct response to the environment, a culinary strategy built around hearty, calorie-dense foods that could generate the body heat needed to survive. The kitchen, with its ever-burning cooking fire, was often the warmest room in the house, a hub of savory smells and comforting steam. The stars of the winter menu were dishes that could make the most of the constant, low heat from the hearth or the coal-fired range. Slow-cooked stews were a staple. Chunks of tough, cheap cuts of beef or mutton would be simmered for hours with whatever vegetables were available, slowly transforming into a rich, tender, and deeply satisfying meal. The same principle applied to meat pies, with their thick crusts and savory fillings, which could be left to cook slowly, filling the house with a rich, savory aroma for hours. In an age before global shipping and refrigerated transport, fresh produce was scarce in winter. The diet relied heavily on what could be stored. Root vegetables were the bedrock of winter cooking. Potatoes, turnips, parsnips, and carrots, harvested in the autumn, could be kept for months in a cool, dark cellar. They provided essential carbohydrates and bulk to winter meals, turning a simple stew into a substantial feast. This necessity made the skills of pickling and preserving absolutely critical. The autumn harvest was a time of intense activity as households prepared for the lean months ahead. Fruits were turned into jams and jellies, vegetables were pickled in vinegar, and meats were salted or smoked. These preserved foods provided a welcome burst of flavor and variety in the midst of a diet that could otherwise be monotonous. For those with the means, the winter seas provided a surprising bounty. Oysters, which we now consider a delicacy, were astonishingly cheap and plentiful in 19th century London. They were a common food for all but the very poorest, often served in stews or pies, providing a valuable source of protein during the cold months. And no dish speaks more to the Victorian need for calories than the suet pudding. This was a dense, heavy, and intensely rich dish made from flour, spices, and suet, which is the hard fat from around the kidneys of cattle. Whether made savory, as in a steak and kidney pudding, or sweet, like a spotted dick, these puddings were designed to provide a massive, slow-release burst of energy, a perfect fortification against the cold. Of course, warmth was also found in a cup. Hot drinks were not just a comfort, they were a necessity. Tea had become the national drink, and the comforting warmth of a ceramic mug of hot, sweet tea held between cupped hands was a daily ritual for millions. It was a simple, affordable pleasure that helped to drive the chill from one's bones. But there were also more potent options. Hot alcoholic drinks were extremely popular. Taverns and homes would serve steaming glasses of hot gin punch, a mixture of gin, hot water, sugar, and lemon. Mulled wine, a festive concoction of red wine heated with spices like cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg, and a slice of orange, was another favorite. It filled the air with a spicy, aromatic scent that was the very essence of winter cheer. Even ale was sometimes served hot and spiced. On the streets, vendors did a brisk trade in simple, warming snacks. The most iconic of these were roasted chestnuts. The sight of a chestnut seller standing over a glowing brazier, and the slightly sweet, nutty taste of a chestnut fresh from the fire, was a classic winter experience. The steam rising from a bowl of hot porridge on a dark morning was the standard beginning to the day for many, especially in the working-class districts. This gruel, as it was often called, was cheap, filling, and provided a warm start to a long, cold day of labor. For those who could afford a large joint of meat, the roasting jack was a clever piece of technology. This clockwork or steam-powered device was set up in front of the hearth and would slowly rotate a spit, allowing the meat to cook evenly in the radiant heat of the fire. The dripping fat would be collected in a pan below, a precious resource in itself. And for many poor families, this fat, the drippings, was a primary source of calories. A meal might consist of nothing more than a thick slice of bread spread with cold drippings. It was a grim, monotonous diet, but it provided the sheer energy needed to work and survive in the brutal cold. The contrast between the rich, simmering stews of a middle-class home and the stark meal of bread and fat in a tenement illustrates the vast gulf in the daily experience of a Victorian winter. With bodies fortified by warm clothes and hot food, the Victorians then had to face the challenges that lay just outside their front door in a city transformed by ice and snow. Navigating the frozen metropolis was a daily struggle, a hazardous journey through a landscape that was both beautiful and treacherous. The very engines of the city, its thousands of horses, were the first to feel the strain. Imagine the sound, the jarring, scraping noise of a metal carriage wheel sliding sideways on a patch of unseen ice, followed by the panicked shouts of the driver. Horses, powerful and essential, struggled immensely on the slippery cobblestones. A fall was a common and dangerous event. A horse with a broken leg would have to be shot on the spot, a grim piece of public theater. A fallen horse could also cause a massive traffic jam, a tangle of carriages and carts that could paralyze a street for hours. The sight of a horse's labored breath turning to thick white clouds in the frigid air was a constant reminder of the immense physical effort required to move the city. To combat this, farriers, the blacksmiths who shod horses, were kept busy with winter work. They would fit the horses' iron shoes with special frost studs or calkins. These were sharp, pointed projections forged into the shoe that could bite into the ice and provide some measure of grip. It was a crucial adaptation, but it could not eliminate the danger entirely. The city's waterways, its other great arteries of commerce and transport, were equally vulnerable. The River Thames, the lifeblood of London, could be brought to a halt. While the Great Stink of 1858 was a famous summer event caused by heat and sewage, winter brought its own foul problems. The freezing of the river could trap raw sewage and industrial waste in the ice, creating a stagnant, foul-smelling mess that would be released in a great, noxious wave when the thaw finally came. And yet, in the very harshest winters, when the ice on the Thames grew thick enough to support the weight of thousands, an old tradition was sometimes revived. Impromptu frost fairs would spring up on the frozen river. Tents and stalls would be erected, and Londoners would venture out onto the ice to buy goods, drink, and skate, a surreal and joyous festival held on the immobilized heart of their city. But the freezing of the canals was an unmitigated disaster for the city's economy. These man-made waterways were the major arteries for transporting heavy goods, most importantly, coal. When the canals froze solid, the barges could not move. The supply of coal to the city would dwindle, crippling the supply chain. This inevitably led to a sharp rise in the price of fuel, a terrifying prospect for poor families who depended on it for what little warmth they had. It was during this era, however, that a new and revolutionary form of transport emerged from beneath the chaotic streets. The first line of the London Underground, the Metropolitan Railway, opened in 1863. For those who could afford a ticket, it offered a remarkable escape from the weather. Its steam-powered trains chugged through smoky, subterranean tunnels, impervious to the snow and ice that paralyzed the city above. It was a glimpse of a future where humanity could conquer the disruptions of the winter weather. But for the average person on foot, the simple act of walking was fraught with peril. Sidewalks were uneven and treacherous, covered in a slick layer of packed snow and ice. Falls were a common cause of injury, from sprained ankles to broken bones. The weight of heavy snow also posed a threat from above. It could accumulate on rooftops and on older, poorly constructed buildings. This immense weight could, and sometimes did, cause the roof to collapse, a sudden and devastating event. The cold and snow also slowed the flow of information. Mail delivery, which relied on men on foot and horse-drawn carts, was severely delayed during bad weather. Letters and news that would normally take a day to cross the city might take a week, isolating people and disrupting business. The acrid smell of coal smoke, which normally rose into the atmosphere, would hang low. and heavy over the frozen city in the still, cold air, a constant, irritating presence in one's eyes and throat. For the vast working population, the paralysis of the city was an economic crisis. Many laborers were paid by the day. If they couldn't get to their jobs at the docks, factories, or construction sites, they simply weren't paid. Yet, this shared struggle against the elements was not experienced equally. The battle for warmth was, in reality, two very different wars, fought along the stark lines of social class. For the wealthy, winter was a challenge to be managed with resources. For the poor, it was a brutal fight for sheer existence. Step inside a wealthy home in a fashionable London square. The air is warm. There are multiple fireplaces, perhaps one in the drawing room, another in the dining room, and even one in the master bedroom. Each is tended by a servant who ensures it is always well stocked with the best quality coal, bought by the ton at the beginning of the season. The rooms are lit by the bright, steady glow of multiple gas lamps, their light reflecting off polished furniture and silverware. You can see thick velvet curtains hanging over the windows, not just for decoration, but as another heavy barrier against the drafts. The smell is of roasting meat from the kitchen, beeswax polish, and perhaps the faint scent of perfume. Now, contrast this with a visit to a tenement room in a slum, a district like Seven Dials or the East End. Here, an entire family might live in a single, cramped space. The cold is a physical presence. There is no insulation. A broken window pane might be stuffed with old rags, a pathetic defense against the wind. If there is a fireplace, it is small and inefficient. More often, there is none, and the only warmth comes from a small, portable brazier, if the family can afford the fuel. Coal is a precious commodity, bought in tiny, expensive quantities from a local vendor, or scavenged as small lumps from the waste heaps of factories and railways. The only light comes from a single, sputtering candle, casting long, dancing shadows on the damp, peeling walls. There are no curtains, only a thin, ragged blanket, perhaps, hung over the window. The smell here is of damp, of sickness, of unwashed bodies, crowded together for warmth. The sound is of a persistent, hacking cough, a sound that echoes through the thin walls of the lodging house, a constant refrain of the diseases that thrived in these conditions. The diet of the two households tells the same story. The wealthy family dines on a diet rich in meat, fats, and preserved fruits, providing ample calories to fight the cold. The poor family subsists on a monotonous diet of bread, perhaps a few potatoes, and the ever-present weak tea. This malnourishment made them far more vulnerable to the host of diseases that flourished in the winter months: pneumonia, bronchitis, tuberculosis, and influenza. When sickness struck a wealthy home, a doctor could be summoned. He would arrive in his carriage, bringing with him the best medicines and advice the era could offer. When sickness struck the poor, there was no doctor. The only relief might come from a charity or a local church. For many, a winter illness was a death sentence. In fact, winter was the busiest season for the city's pawnbrokers. As the cold deepened and work became scarce, the poor were forced to sell their meager possessions. A family might pawn their Sunday clothes, a few pieces of cutlery, or even their bedding, all for a few shillings to buy a little food or a small bag of coal. It was a cycle of desperation from which it was nearly impossible to escape. It makes one think about our own lives. What small comfort or simple ritual helps you get through the coldest days where you are? Your stories add such a warm layer to our shared experience. And so for the two Londons, winter meant two different things. For the wealthy, it was a grand social season. With the discomfort of travel making country visits less appealing, the city's elite retreated indoors for a season of lavish balls, dinner parties, and theater outings. For the poor, it was a season of sickness, unemployment, and a constant, gnawing hunger. Hypothermia, though it might have been recorded simply as exposure or found dead, was a common end for the homeless, the elderly, and the destitute. The battle for warmth was a war, and its casualties were overwhelmingly drawn from the ranks of the poor. As the harsh day ended, another, equally formidable challenge began for everyone. Rich and poor alike, the long, dark, and often frightening Victorian night. As the harsh day ended, another, equally formidable challenge began for everyone. Rich and poor alike, the long, dark, and often frightening Victorian night. The sun, a weak and distant visitor, even at midday, would abandon the city early, leaving it to the mercy of a profound and oppressive darkness. This was not the modern darkness we know, a darkness punctuated by the glow of streetlights, screens, and distant cities. This was a deep, absolute blackness, a tyranny of the dark, that fundamentally shaped the experience of life. Inside the home, the family retreated to a small, fragile bubble of light and life. This light was a living thing, a presence that had to be tended and maintained. In the more affluent city homes, the brightest option was gaslighting. It was a modern marvel, piping light into the home just as it piped water. But this light was not silent or sterile. It hissed. A soft, gentle, and constant hiss was the soundtrack to a well-lit Victorian parlor, the sound of progress itself. Yet, it also gave off a faint, chemical smell and consumed the precious oxygen from the room, making a long evening feel stuffy and close. The source of the bright glow was a delicate thing called a gas mantle. This small, mesh-like dome would incandesce when heated by the gas flame, producing a light far brighter than a simple flame. But these mantles were incredibly fragile, little more than ash held in shape, and they could shatter from a slight vibration or a door slammed too hard, plunging a room into semi-darkness until a replacement could be carefully fitted. And even in these modern homes, gaslight was a luxury reserved for the main rooms. The parlor, the dining room, the study, these were the spaces of public family life. To venture beyond them, into the hallways, up the stairs, and into the bedrooms, was to travel back in time. Here, the older, more intimate light of candles and oil lamps still held sway. Carrying a candlestick to bed was not a romantic gesture. It was a simple necessity. And what were these candles made of? For the majority of people, they were made from tallow, which is rendered animal fat. Tallow candles had significant drawbacks. They produced a greasy, sputtering light, and they were notoriously smoky. They also gave off an unpleasant, fatty smell as they burned, and the slightly greasy smell of a tallow candle being extinguished was a familiar, if unwelcome, end to the day. For the wealthy, the alternative was beeswax. Beeswax candles burned with a cleaner, brighter flame, produced less smoke, and gave off a faint, sweet, honey-like scent. They were a small but significant indicator of a family's status. For the very poorest, even a tallow candle was an expense to be considered. Their primary light source might be a rushlight. This was a simple, homemade device created by dipping a dried reed into melted fat or grease. It produced a very dim, smoky, and flickering light that would only last for a short time before being consumed. It was a meager light for a meager existence, just enough to see the faces of your family in the gloom. In many homes, the most reliable and common source of light was the oil lamp. These lamps, with their glass reservoirs and adjustable wicks, were an improvement on candles, but they required constant maintenance. Every day, the wicks had to be trimmed to ensure they burned evenly and without excessive smoke. The clear glass chimney that protected the flame would become coated in a fine layer of black soot and had to be carefully removed and cleaned, a delicate task that, if done carelessly, could result in a shattered chimney and a useless lamp. And beyond this small circle of managed light, the darkness outside was absolute. To look out of a window was to stare into a void. The deep, inky blackness was something unfamiliar to the modern mind. It swallowed landmarks and erased the familiar contours of the world, making travel at night a perilous undertaking. The few gas streetlights cast lonely pools of light, separated by vast stretches of shadow where anything or anyone could be waiting. And so, a unique profession existed to combat this. Link boys, usually poor children, would wait near taverns and theaters. For a small fee, they would carry a burning torch or link to light the way for a pedestrian through the dark and treacherous streets. They were temporary guides, their small, dancing flames a welcome beacon in the overwhelming darkness. This world of low, flickering light had a profound impact on daily life. For those who tried to read or perform fine needlework in the evenings, the conditions were a major cause of eye strain. People would huddle close to the light source, their eyes struggling to make out the words on a page or the fine details of a piece of embroidery. The very act of seeing required effort. But this stark contrast between the inside and the outside created a powerful psychological effect. To be indoors was to be safe. The drawn curtains, the locked door, the warm, glowing light of the fire, and the lampsit all created an intense feeling of sanctuary. The home became a fortress, a small island of warmth and life adrift in a vast, cold, and silent sea of darkness. The way the shadows would dance and leap on the walls from the flickering of a single candle flame was a constant, moving mural, a reminder of the fragility of the light. And the sight of the intricate, feathery patterns of frost on a window pane, glowing softly in the lamplight, was a vision of beautiful but cold isolation. You could feel the security of being in that small circle of light, a profound sense of separation from the immense darkness that lay just on the other side of the glass. Confined to these small pockets of light, families had to find ways to pass the long, dark hours. With the outside world largely inaccessible and the day's hard labor done, the winter evening became a time for turning inward. This necessity led to a golden age of indoor entertainment, activities that drew the family together around the glow of the hearth. Perhaps the most important of these pastimes was reading. Literacy rates rose dramatically throughout the Victorian era, and for the first time, books and periodicals were affordable and accessible to a wide audience. This created a ravenous appetite for stories. The novel, in particular, became the dominant art form of the age, and many of the era's greatest authors, like Charles Dickens, first published their work not as complete books, but in cheap monthly installments. The arrival of the next part of a serialized story was a highly anticipated family event, a fresh chapter to be devoured and discussed. And the way these stories were consumed was often a shared experience. The practice of reading aloud was extremely common. After the evening meal, the family would gather in the parlor. The head of the family, usually the father, would take up the book or the newspaper and read, his steady, rhythmic voice filling the quiet room. The rest of the family would listen as they performed other quiet tasks. The women might be occupied with sewing, mending, or embroidery, their hands busy while their minds were captivated by the tale. Of course, not every evening was spent in quiet listening. Parlor games were enormously popular, a way to create laughter and amusement within the four walls of home. Games like charades brought out a theatrical flair, as family members acted out words and phrases for others to guess. Blind Man's Bluff, a more boisterous game, would fill the room with shouts and laughter. And for quieter moments, a growing variety of board games, card games, and puzzles offered a more strategic form of entertainment. Music was also a vital part of the indoor world. For a middle or upper-class family, a piano in the parlor was an essential symbol of status and refinement. The ability to play the piano or sing was a key social skill, especially for young women. An evening might be spent with family members taking turns to play and sing popular songs, the faint melodic notes of the piano drifting through the quiet house. It was a way to create beauty and harmony in a world that was often harsh and discordant. And what better setting for a certain kind of story than a dark and stormy winter's night? Ghost stories and spooky tales were considered particularly appropriate for telling around the crackling fire. The flickering light, the deep shadows in the corners of the room, and the moan of the wind in the chimney all created the perfect atmosphere for a tale of the supernatural. This tradition became so ingrained that it is a key reason why we still associate ghost stories with Christmas time today. The long hours also provided ample opportunity for personal hobbies and crafts. Scrapbooking became a popular pastime, with people carefully cutting out and pasting pictures, poems, and keepsakes into large albums. Pressing flowers gathered in the summer, writing long and detailed letters to friends and relatives, and sketching were other ways to fill the quiet hours productively and creatively. The rustle of a newspaper page turning, or the quiet snip of scissors cutting out a scrapbook image, were the gentle sounds of a peaceful evening. And for the children, the world of imagination could be vast, even within a single room. Simple toys' spinning top, a set of wooden soldiers, a porcelain doll, a rocking horse could provide the basis for hours of imaginative play. They created their own worlds, their own stories, in the warm and secure space carved out by the firelight. One of the most wondrous sources of entertainment was a device called the magic lantern. This was an early form of slide projector. Hand-painted glass slides were inserted into a metal box with a lens and a light source, usually an oil lamp. It would project large, glowing, colorful images onto a blank wall. For a family in the 19th century, this was a truly magical experience, a chance to see vivid pictures of exotic lands, historical events, or comical stories appear as if from nowhere. All of these shared activities did more than simply pass the time. They strengthened the bonds of the family. They created a sense of collective sanctuary, a shared inner world that stood in defiance of the cold and the dark outside. The sight of a family's faces, intent and focused on a story or a game, all illuminated by the same warm glow of the fire, was a powerful image of unity and security. The simple smell of old paper and leather from a well-loved book was the scent of this shared indoor world. while the world inside was filled with these quiet human sounds. The world outside had a unique and peaceful soundscape of its own. The snow and the cold did not just change how the city looked, they fundamentally altered how it sounded. The blanket of fresh snow that covered the streets and rooftops was an excellent sound absorber. It soaked up the ambient noise of the city, creating a deep, profound silence that could feel almost eerie to those accustomed to the constant urban din. The sharp, rattling clatter of iron-shod hooves and iron-rimmed wheels on cobblestones was gone. In its place was the soft, dull thud of horses treading carefully on packed snow. The rumble of carriages was muffled into a distant whisper. The whole city seemed to be holding its breath. The usual cacophony of street life was muted, the shouts of the few remaining street vendors sounding less sharp, their cries absorbed by the snow-filled air. And yet, in the strange physics of a cold, still night, some sounds could become unnaturally clear. The dense, cold air could carry noise over long distances. A distant train whistle the lonely chime of a clock tower across the sleeping city. Or the tolling of a church bell might reach the ear with a startling clarity, each note hanging in the frigid air before fading away. It created a soundscape of distinct, isolated noises against a backdrop of deep silence. The most personal and pervasive sound of this new world was the crunch of footsteps in dry, cold snow. It was a crisp, sharp, and satisfying sound, a clear announcement of your own presence in the quiet landscape. As you walked, each step was a sharp percussion in the stillness. The wind was another constant auditory presence. It was a sound that seemed almost alive. You could hear it howling around the corners of tall buildings and moaning low in the chimney. It was the voice of the cold itself, a reminder of the power of the natural world, even in the heart of the great city. Inside the home, the silence from outside made the small sounds of the house seem much louder. The gentle creak of floorboards, the groan of timbers settling under the weight of snow, and especially the constant gentle crackle of the fire in the hearth, these became the dominant sounds of the evening. And there were other, more subtle sounds of winter. The sudden, loud crack of ice shifting on a frozen pond or canal could be a startling interruption of the quiet. And during a brief thaw, when the temperature hovered just above freezing, the gentle, rhythmic dripping sound of melting icicles from the eaves was a hopeful sound, a tiny hint that winter's relentless grip might eventually be loosening. This dramatic shift in the city's sounds contributed significantly to the psychological feeling of the season. It fostered a sense of isolation, a feeling that the whole world had slowed down, that time itself was moving at a more deliberate, measured pace. This quiet, frozen world was not just a yearly occurrence. Sometimes the cold would reach historic extremes, turning the city into a stage for remarkable events. These were the winters that would be remembered for generations, the great frosts that became the stuff of legend. The 19th century was the tail end of a climatic period known as the Little Ice Age, a time of generally cooler temperatures that made severe winters more common than they are today. The most famous of these events, the last great frost fair on the River Thames, actually took place just before the Victorian era officially began in the winter of 1814. But its memory loomed large in the Victorian consciousness. For weeks, the river froze solid, the ice thick enough to support thousands of people. An entire festival city sprang up on the ice. Shops and pubs were erected in wooden tents. printing presses were hauled onto the frozen river to print souvenir cards for visitors. An elephant was famously led across the solid Thames near Blackfriars Bridge, a spectacular demonstration of the ice's strength. A key reason this was possible was the old London Bridge. Its many narrow arches acted like a dam, slowing the river's flow and trapping ice, making it much more likely to freeze solid. When the old bridge was demolished and replaced in 1831 with a new one that had much wider arches, the river's flow increased, and it never froze solid in the same way again. The age of the great frost fairs was over. But severe freezes still occurred. One of the most brutal of the Victorian era was the Great Freeze of 1895. For weeks, the country was locked in a deep and bitter cold. The Thames froze over at Windsor, and there were reports of sea ice forming in the English Channel. All river and canal transport ceased completely, creating economic chaos. The supply of food and fuel to the city was choked off, causing prices to soar and leading to immense hardship for the poor. During these extreme events, the city's charities and soup kitchens would work overtime. They were overwhelmed by the thousands of dock workers, bargemen, and laborers who were left unemployed and freezing by the halted commerce. For these people, a great frost was not a novelty, it was a catastrophe. And so, these dramatic weather events were remembered in two ways. They were seen by some as moments of great community and wonder, a time when the familiar world was transformed into a strange and exciting new landscape. But they were also remembered as times of immense suffering and desperation. These shared, dramatic experiences became part of London's folklore, powerful stories of winter's awesome power that were passed down through generations. These grand spectacles, born of hardship, serve as a powerful reminder of the era's core truth. Survival in the Victorian winter was a story of both immense struggle and incredible resilience. And so, the Victorian family, huddled around their fire, survived the night. They survived the day. They endured the season. Their story is not one of grand battles, but of countless small victories, a well-mended coat, a hot meal, a shared story in the dark. It is a quiet testament to human ingenuity and the simple, profound comfort of a single warm flame against the vast, encroaching cold. I hope this part of our journey has been restful for you. Please let me know what thoughts or feelings it brought to mind. As we drift further now, we leave the main story behind and explore the lingering echoes of this frozen time. As our journey through the frozen streets and fire-lit rooms of the past begins to draw to a close, we find ourselves in a quiet, reflective space. The immediate, desperate struggle for survival has passed, like a fever that has broken with the dawn. Now, in the calm that follows, we can begin to trace the long, slow echoes of that time. The Victorian winter, with its profound challenges, did not simply end. It left an indelible mark on the world, shaping the very concept of comfort, the stories we tell, the traditions we cherish, and the air we breathe. The constant, daily battle against the cold planted a seed in the inventive mind of the 19th century. It was a simple but revolutionary idea. What if warmth was not something you had to huddle close to? What if it could be made to fill a room, to move through a house, to create an entire environment of stable, reliable comfort? This question, born of shivering nights and drafty hallways, gave rise to the invention of comfort as we know it today. And so, deep in the basements of the grandest homes, a new kind of heart began to beat. It was the rhythmic, clanking sound of a coal-fired boiler, a powerful engine dedicated to a single purpose: heating water. From this boiler, a network of iron arteries would spread throughout the house, carrying hot water or steam to every major room. Here, the heat was released through ornate cast iron radiators. These were not the sleek, functional panels of today. They were works of industrial art, often decorated with intricate floral patterns, their surfaces a beautiful testament to the era's love of ornamentation. Imagine the feeling in a home that had, for the first time, this remarkable system. There was no longer a single island of warmth. The entire house felt different. The gentle, hissing sound and radiant warmth from a radiator in the corner of a room meant you could sit and read anywhere you liked, not just by the fire. It was a quiet, constant, and pervasive warmth, a victory over the room's natural state of chill. Of course, this was a luxury reserved for the very wealthy, a dream of universal comfort that would take another century to become commonplace. But the dream had begun. The drive for warmth also spurred more subtle innovations. Builders began to experiment with the very structure of their walls. The idea of the cavity wall began to take hold, a design that left a small, empty air gap between two layers of brick. This trapped air acted as a surprisingly effective insulator, slowing the relentless passage of cold from the outside in. In the same way, the use of weather stripping became more common. Strips of thick felt or even rubber were tacked around window frames. And at the bottom of doors, a more formal and effective solution than the simple, sand-filled sausage dog of old. And in the kitchen, the open hearth, for so long the center of cooking and warmth, began to be replaced by a marvel of modern engineering, the enclosed cooking range, or kitchener. This cast-iron behemoth was far more efficient. It enclosed the fire, directing its heat to ovens, warming plates, and hot water tanks, all while radiating a steady warmth into the kitchen itself. It made cooking more precise, and the kitchen a far more comfortable place to be. Even personal warmth became a subject of scientific inquiry. In 1892, a Scottish scientist named Sir James Dewar was conducting research into the field of cryogenics, the study of very low temperatures. To keep his chemical solutions at a stable temperature, he invented a double-walled glass container with a vacuum between the walls. This vacuum was a near-perfect insulator, preventing heat from passing in or out. The invention, which he never patented for commercial use, would become known to the world as the thermos or the vacuum flask. It was the simple, modern magic of being able to pour a hot cup of tea hours after it was made, a small, portable piece of warmth, a personal victory over the cold. These innovations, from the grand central heating system to the humble vacuum flask, were all part of a larger shift in thinking. The Victorians began to formalize the study of thermal comfort as a scientific and engineering goal. The age-old acceptance of winter's discomfort began to give way to a new expectation that our indoor environments could be controlled. Public buildings, like the new free libraries and museums, were often the first to be centrally heated, and they became unofficial warm havens for the poor, a place to escape the brutal cold of the streets for a few hours. This quest for warmth, this simple human desire not to be cold, was a quiet but powerful engine, driving a significant portion of the engineering and industrial innovation of the late 19th century. It was the slow, steady invention of the world we now take for granted. A world where the feeling of a thick, heavy curtain drawn against the night's chill is more of a comfort than a necessity. This drive for physical comfort ran parallel to the way the winter season was being captured and explored in the period's most enduring art form, literature. As the Victorian body sought warmth from the cold, the Victorian imagination sought meaning in it. The winter landscape, with its stark beauty and its inherent dangers, became a powerful canvas upon which authors could paint their deepest themes. Think of the works of Charles Dickens. In his masterpiece, A Christmas Carol, the cold is more than just a weather condition. It is a profound metaphor. The world outside is freezing, but the true cold emanates from the heart of Ebenezer Scrooge. His office is cold because he is too cheap to buy coal. His heart is cold to the pleas of the poor and the joy of the season. The physical winter of London is a direct mirror of the spiritual winter within him. His redemption is not just a change of heart, but a literal warming. He buys a giant turkey, he gives money to the poor, and he tells his clerk to buy another coal scuttle. He brings warmth, both literal and figurative, back into the world. Now, let your mind drift to the wild, snow-swept moors of Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. Here, the winter is not a social metaphor, but a psychological one. The desolate, wind-swept landscape, buried under snow, is a perfect physical manifestation of the character's passionate, untamed, and often cruel emotions. The isolation of the house, the howling of the wind, the sheer bleak emptiness of the world outside it all reflects the tormented inner lives of Catherine and Heathcliff. Their love is not a cozy fireside romance. It is as wild and unforgiving as a blizzard on the moors. Her sister, Charlotte Bronte, used winter in a different, but no less powerful, way. In Jane Eyre, the scenes of Jane's childhood at Lowood School are marked by a brutal, penetrating cold. The girls are given thin clothes and meager portions of food. They shiver in their unheated dormitories. This physical suffering is a direct reflection of the emotional cruelty and spiritual deprivation of the institution. Winter at Lowood is a season of pure survival, and Jane's endurance of it is a testament to the strength of her spirit. In the south of England, in his fictional county of Wessex, Thomas Hardy often used the stark, unforgiving winter landscape to highlight the struggles of his characters against an indifferent nature and an inescapable fate. The image of a lone figure walking across a vast, empty, snowy landscape is a recurring one in his novels. Winter for Hardy is a time when the illusions of civilization are stripped away, leaving only the bare elemental struggle for existence. And in the foggy, gaslit streets of London, winter provides the perfect atmospheric backdrop for the mysteries of Sherlock Holmes. The swirling fog, the muffled sounds, the sense of hidden things, it all creates a world of intrigue and danger. The famous apartment at 221B Baker Street, with its roaring fire and cozy clutter, becomes the ultimate sanctuary of reason and order. A warm, bright island in a city made mysterious and uncertain by the winter gloom. The sight of gaslight filtering through a frosty window pane, as described in one of these tales, became an iconic image of the era. This connection between winter and literature was reinforced by the way stories were published. The rise of the periodical press meant that stories set in winter were often released in installments during the winter months, allowing readers to experience the fictional cold while feeling the real cold just outside their window. The sound of the wind rattling the window frame as you read about a storm in a story created a powerful, immersive experience. The quiet turning of a page in a silent, sleeping house was an escape, a journey into a world that felt intensely real. Winter in these stories became a metaphor for social neglect, for poverty, for loneliness, but also for hope, for reflection, and for the profound comfort of the warm, safe interior. And these literary depictions have had such a lasting effect that they continue to shape how we imagine that entire century. And nowhere was this imaginative power more focused than on one specific holiday, which the Victorians would take and transform from a minor observance into the grand celebration we know today. They effectively invented the modern Christmas, weaving together old traditions and new ideas to create a powerful, idealized vision of the winter season. Before the Victorian era, Christmas in England was a relatively quiet affair, a religious holiday that had been suppressed by Puritans in centuries past and had never fully recovered its cultural significance. But a new spirit was rising in the 19th century, one that emphasized family, home, and childhood. And into this environment came a young queen, Victoria, and her German husband, Prince Albert. Albert brought with him the traditions of his homeland, the most captivating of which was the Christmas tree. In the 1840s, popular magazines published engravings of the royal family gathered around their decorated fir tree, and the tradition spread with astonishing speed. The fresh pine scent of an evergreen tree brought indoors became the new, definitive aroma of the season. The sending of Christmas cards, as we have seen, also exploded during this time. The introduction of the penny post in 1840 made sending mail affordable for nearly everyone. What had been a luxury for the rich became a massive, nationwide tradition. It was a way to connect with family and friends, to share a moment of warmth and goodwill across the cold distances. But the most profound shift was in the very spirit of the holiday. The idea of Christmas as a time for family gatherings, centered on the innocence and joy of children, was a distinctly Victorian ideal. It was a time to close the doors against the harsh world and create a perfect, warm sanctuary of domestic bliss. This was the era that gave us the Christmas cracker, invented by a London confectioner named Tom Smith, its crisp snap becoming a new and essential sound of the festive dinner. And it was Dickens' A Christmas Carol that truly cemented the holiday's new identity. The story tied the celebration of Christmas directly to the themes of charity, generosity, and redemption. It created a powerful narrative that suggested the best way to find warmth in the bleak midwinter was to share it with others. This idea resonated deeply with the Victorian conscience, and the holiday became a focal point for charitable giving. The food on the table changed to the roast turkey. A bird from the New World became the popular centerpiece for a Christmas feast, gradually replacing the traditional goose for any family that could afford it. And many of the carols we sing today were composed or popularized in the mid-19th century, their melodies weaving themselves into the fabric of the season. Even the image of Father Christmas, or Santa Claus, was standardized during this period, evolving from various folk traditions into the jolly, white-bearded figure in a red suit that we recognize today. The soft, warm glow of candlelight reflecting off hand-blown glass ornaments on the tree, the smell of roasting turkey and rich plum pudding, the sight of a family gathered together, their faces lit by the joy of the season. This entire sensory world was largely a Victorian creation. It was a beautiful, powerful, and idealized vision of winter, one that often stood in stark contrast to the daily reality of the cold, but one that has endured as a source of comfort and hope ever since. But the fuel that warmed these festive scenes, that cooked the Christmas goose, and that powered the entire industrial era, left its own deep and lasting mark on the world. The warmth of the Victorian hearth had a long and lingering shadow, an echo that we are still contending with today. The Industrial Revolution ran on a single fuel, coal, and the millions of domestic fireplaces, each puffing out its own stream of smoke, added their burden to the already polluted air from factories, railways, and steamships. The result was the infamous London fog. This was not the clean white mist of the countryside. This was smog, a thick, toxic combination of natural fog and millions of tiny black smoke particles from the relentless burning of coal. This smog was acidic and corrosive. It could be so dense that it would turn midday into a murky, yellow-black twilight, forcing traffic to a standstill and prompting the streetlights to be lit at noon. People would navigate by touching the walls of buildings, their world reduced to a few feet of visibility, and this smog was a killer. It caused severe respiratory problems, contributing to soaring death rates from bronchitis, pneumonia, and other lung ailments, especially among the very young and the elderly. The air itself was dangerous. It had a gritty taste, a sharp, sulfuric smell, and it left a dark, greasy film of grime on every surface, inside and out. The beautiful stone facades of London's buildings were stained black, creating the dark, Gothic image of the Victorian city that has been so fixed in our imagination by films and illustrations. There were attempts to control the pollution. Smoke nuisance abatement acts were passed, but they were largely ineffective. They primarily targeted large industrial smokestacks, but they did nothing to address the root of the problem, the millions of domestic chimneys that each contributed its small but significant share to the foul air. The economy, and indeed the very survival of the population in winter, was so completely reliant on coal that any meaningful regulation was seen as impossible. This was the beginning of a new chapter in the human story. The sheer scale of coal consumption during this period meant that the amount of carbon dioxide being released into the atmosphere began to rise sharply. The Victorians, in their desperate and necessary quest for warmth, had unknowingly begun a process that would have consequences for the entire planet. Their winter, therefore, was not just cold. It was often dark and dirty, even in the middle of the day. The feeling of a raw, irritated throat after a day spent breathing the city air was a common experience. The dream of a warm, cozy interior was paid for with a polluted and unhealthy exterior. The world of the Victorians, with its challenges and its innovations, feels both distant and strangely near. As we drift now deeper into rest, we can feel the threads that connect our time to theirs. Their quiet struggle against the cold paved the way for our modern comfort, a legacy written in both brilliant innovation and in the lingering echoes of coal and smoke. The patterns of frost on their window panes have been replaced by the double glazing of ours, but the fundamental human desire for a safe, warm place to call home remains unchanged. The echoes of that time are all around us. They are in the classic novels we read on a winter's night, their pages filled with the atmosphere of that frozen world. They are in the carols we sing, in the shape of the Christmas tree in the town square, in the very idea that winter is a time for generosity and for gathering close with the ones we love. Their story is a quiet testament to endurance, a reminder of a time when a single flame was a precious thing, a time when the simple comfort of a hot meal and a warm room was a victory, hard won, against the vast, encroaching cold of the world outside. I hope these reflections have been a gentle companion as you unwind. Let your mind drift now as we explore a few last quiet corners of this bygone era, allowing the details to become part of your dreams. Let the gentle hiss of a gas lamp, the quiet turning of a page, and the distant, muffled sound of hooves on snow carry you now further and further into a deep and peaceful rest. The world we have been exploring is deep in a quiet slumber now. The main stories have been told, the great struggles have been laid to rest, and all that remains are the faintest of echoes, the forgotten details that linger like frost patterns on a window pane at dawn. As we drift in this peaceful space, let us wander through some of these last quiet corners of a frozen world, not to learn but simply to observe, to let the images and sounds become a gentle companion to our own descent into rest. Our first stop is on the shore of a vast, frozen lake, far from the city's smoky haze. It is the heart of winter, and the ice is thick, strong, and silent. Here, a lost industry is in motion, a trade built on the very essence of the cold. This was the world of the ice harvester. Before the age of artificial refrigeration, ice itself was a valuable commodity, a crop to be harvested from the land in its coldest season. Imagine the sight, the surface of the lake, a vast, unbroken sheet of white, is scored with long, straight lines, a perfect grid laid out across the ice. Upon this grid, teams of men and horses work in the biting cold, their breath plumes in the frigid air. The men wield long, specialized saws with heavy, sharp teeth. We can almost hear the rhythmic, grating sound of the saw blade cutting through the thick, clear ice. It is a slow, laborious sound, a duet with the crisp crunch of boots on the snow-covered surface. The horses, their hooves fitted with sharp calkins for grip, are used to pull large ice plows that score the lines deeper, guiding the sawyers in their work. Slowly, methodically, they carve the frozen lake into a series of massive, uniform blocks. Each block, a perfect rectangle of solid winter, might weigh hundreds of pounds. Using long poles with sharp hooks, the men pry these blocks free, revealing the dark, impossibly cold water of the lake below. The great blocks are then floated down carefully prepared channels of open water, guided by the harvesters towards the shore. It is a slow, silent parade of frozen water, glistening in the low winter sun. At the edge of the lake stands a strange and imposing building. It is the ice house, often built partially underground for better insulation. It is a fortress against warmth. Its walls are thick, sometimes several feet thick, and packed with insulating material like sawdust or straw. As the great blocks of ice arrive, they are hoisted up a ramp and moved into the deep, cold darkness of the ice house. Here, they are carefully stacked, with a thick layer of sawdust packed between each block and all around the stack. The cold, damp, earthy smell of the underground ice house is the smell of preserved winter. In this cold, dark, and silent place, the ice could be kept for many months. The harvest of January could last through the heat of the following July and August. This stored cold was then transported, often over great distances. The industry was enormous. Ice from the clean, clear lakes of Norway was shipped in specially insulated vessels to the bustling port of London, a precious cargo of captured winter. And from these great storage houses, a new figure in daily life would emerge, the Iceman. He was a regular delivery person, his cart or wagon loaded with the great sawdust-covered blocks. His arrival was a welcome sound on a warm day. the clinking of his heavy ice tongs as he grabbed a fresh block, the drip of meltwater on the cobblestones. He would carry the block to the home's icebox, the simple wooden precursor to our modern refrigerator. This insulated cabinet had a compartment for the ice, which would slowly melt, its chill air sinking downwards to cool the perishable foods stored below milk, butter, meat, and fish. For a wealthy household, this delivered ice was more than a convenience. It was a luxury. It was used to chill drinks on a summer's day, a simple pleasure that felt like a miracle. And it allowed for the creation of the ultimate indulgence: frozen desserts. Ice cream, sorbets, and water ices could be made at home, a taste of impossible cold in the warm seasons. It was a status symbol, a tangible expression of wealth and the ability to command the very elements. And then, as the 19th century drew to a close, a new technology began to emerge. The science of artificial refrigeration, the ability to create cold mechanically, began to take root. Slowly, quietly, this new invention made the old ways obsolete. The great harvests on the frozen lakes dwindled. The vast ice houses fell into disuse, and the rhythmic, grating sound of the ice saw faded into silence. The entire industry, once so vital, melted away like the product it sold, leaving behind only the faintest memory of a time when winter itself could be harvested, stored, and sold. This world of cold had its own unique way of speaking, a language shaped by the shared experience of the season. Let us now drift into the quiet of a library, and imagine we are gently turning the pages of an old dictionary, discovering the forgotten slang and the lost phrases that gave voice to the Victorian winter. The words themselves are soft and comforting, echoes from a quiet room. Consider the lovely phrase, "to muffle the doctor." This had nothing to do with silencing a physician. It was a gentle piece of slang that meant to have a comforting, hot, alcoholic drink before going to bed. A hot toddy, a glass of mulled wine, or a gin punch. It was a drink to ward off a chill, to soothe a coming cold, to muffle the need for a doctor's visit. We can almost feel the comforting warmth of the hot drink spreading through the chest, a small, nightly ritual against the cold. We have already heard the term pea souper, but let us linger on it. It is such a wonderfully descriptive word for the thick, yellow-green smogs of London. It captures the color, the density, and the almost edible quality of the polluted air. In the confusion of these fogs, another slang term emerged: fogel hunters. A fogel was a silk handkerchief, and a fogel hunter was a thief who specialized in snatching them, often from the back pockets of gentlemen who were distracted by the disorienting gloom. There is a wonderful old dialect word, nesh. It is not a word you would find in a formal dictionary of the time, but it was a word people used. To be nesh was to be unusually sensitive to the cold, to be the person who was always shivering when others were comfortable. To complain of feeling nesh was to admit a personal vulnerability to the winter chill. Comfort had its own vocabulary, too. A foot warmer was a common and cherished object. It was typically a metal box or container filled with hot coals from the fire or with hot water. It would be taken on long carriage rides or placed discreetly on the floor of a cold church pew, a small personal source of heat. The term well-wrapped was not just a suggestion. It was a statement of vital importance, a recognition that one's health and safety depended on being properly bundled in layers of wool. We can imagine the sounds of children in the street, and hear a mother's voice calling out, "Mind the slide." This was a common warning on icy pavements. Children, then, as now, would find a patch of ice and take great delight in running and sliding across it, making it even more polished and treacherous for the unwary pedestrian. Inside the home, the hearthrug was more than just a decoration. It was a destination. It was the most prized piece of real estate in the house, the single warmest spot outside of being tucked in bed. To have a place on the hearthrug, close to the radiant glow of the fire, was to have achieved a state of perfect winter comfort. And this leads us to a phrase that has survived from that time, one that so perfectly captures the ultimate goal of a Victorian winter evening: to be snug as a bug in a rug. It is a phrase of deep, satisfying coziness, of being completely protected from the world, wrapped in warmth and security. Finally, a curious term from the most private of spaces, the curtain lecture. In an era of large, drafty bedrooms, the bed itself was often a four-poster, hung with heavy curtains. This created a small, enclosed, and relatively warm space. A curtain lecture was the slang term for a scolding given by a wife to her husband within the privacy of this curtained bed, a place of both warmth and confinement, where grievances could be aired in the quiet of the winter night. The image of a heavy velvet curtain drawn against a dark and frosty window was the very picture of this enclosed and private world. Of course, with the cold came the inevitable seasonal sicknesses, and the strange and sometimes wonderful ways the Victorians sought to cure them. Let us leave the library now and drift into the quiet atmosphere of a sick room, where the curtains are drawn and a fire is crackling low in the grate. The air here is still and warm, filled with the sense of home remedies. Winter was a dangerous time. Consumption, the disease we now know as tuberculosis, thrived in the cold, damp conditions of the city slums. Bronchitis and pneumonia were constant threats, major killers in an age before antibiotics. For these serious ailments, there was often little to be done but hope and pray. But for the common coughs, colds, and fevers of the season, every household had its own arsenal of cures. A common and powerful remedy was the mustard plaster. A thick paste would be made from mustard powder and water. This paste was then spread onto a piece of cloth, which was placed directly on the chest of the suffering patient. The sharp, pungent smell of the mustard would fill the room. The plaster would create a sensation of intense heat on the skin, a process called counter-irritation, which was believed to draw out the congestion from deep within the lungs. Cough syrups were ubiquitous, sold by chemists or made at home. These thick, sweet potions often contained ingredients that would be shocking to us today. It was not uncommon for them to include small, unlisted quantities of powerful substances like opium, morphine, or even chloroform. These ingredients were certainly effective at suppressing a cough and inducing a sleepy state of rest, but they were also incredibly dangerous and addictive. But not all remedies were so potent. The simple comfort of hot lemon and honey, sweetened with a bit of sugar, was a recognized soothing drink for a sore throat, a gentle cure that has stood the test of time. Another popular syrup for coughs was made from baked onions. A large onion would be hollowed out, filled with brown sugar, and then baked until the sugar had dissolved into the onion's juices, creating a sweet and pungent syrup. Some cures were based more on folklore than on medicine. Many people firmly believed that the best way to cure a sore throat was to wrap a stocking around it at bedtime. Some versions of the belief specified that it had to be a dirty stocking, worn during the day, for the cure to be effective. The logic, if any, is lost to time. But the image of the soothing warmth of a woolen sock wrapped around a sore throat is one of pure, simple comfort. For a blocked nose or congested sinuses, a common treatment was a steam inhalation. A bowl of steaming hot water would be prepared, sometimes infused with menthol crystals or a few drops of eucalyptus oil. The patient would lean over the bowl with a towel draped over their head and inhale the warm, medicated steam, feeling it open up their airways. And then there were the chilblains. This was a very common and miserable winter affliction, caused by repeated exposure to cold. Chilblains were painful, itchy, red swellings that appeared on the fingers, toes, ears, and nose. There were countless folk remedies for them, of varying effectiveness, but the only true cure was the eventual return of warmer weather. For those who had the means, the best prescription a doctor could offer was often a change of air. Wealthy patients suffering from chronic respiratory conditions would be sent away from the cold, damp, and polluted air of the city. They would travel to warmer seaside resorts in the south of England, or even to the sunny climes of the Mediterranean, escaping the British winter altogether. But for most, the focus was simply on keeping the body warm, on rest, and on the quiet, hopeful atmosphere of the sick room, waiting for the body to heal itself. Leaving behind these thoughts of illness and cure, let us end our journey together with a simple, peaceful walk. There is no more information to absorb, no more stories to tell. There is only this moment. Let us allow the sensory details of this lost world to be our final, gentle companions as we drift completely into sleep. We are standing at the entrance to a park on a quiet, frost-covered morning. The great city is still asleep. The air is perfectly still, and the silence is deep and profound. The ornate iron railings of the park fence are coated in a delicate white layer of hoarfrost, each iron scroll and spear point transformed into a thing of soft, crystalline beauty. We step through the gates, and our footsteps make a crisp, crunching sound on the frozen gravel path. The grass on either side is white and stiff, each blade frozen solid and brittle. It crunches under our feet with a sound like breaking glass. We look up at the trees. They are bare, their branches like dark lace against the pale winter sky. And every single branch, every twig, every tiny sleeping bud is outlined in a perfect, shimmering layer of silver frost. Ahead, we see a flash of color in the monochrome world. It is a robin, its breast a vivid splash of crimson against the white. It sits perfectly still on a frosted branch, a small, warm, living thing in this frozen landscape. As we walk on, we can see our own breath pluming in front of us, a small, fleeting white cloud in the still, cold air. The feeling of the crisp, clean, cold air deep in our lungs is refreshing and pure. The path curves, and through the trees we see the park's pond. It is frozen solid, its surface a smooth, milky white, glimmering softly in the low morning light. There are no skaters yet, no sound of blades on the ice. It is a perfect, untouched mirror reflecting the pale sky. The silence here is even deeper. We pause, and in the stillness we hear a distant sound. It is a church bell chiming the hour. In the cold, dense air, the sound travels with an exceptional clarity, each note pure and resonant, hanging in the air for a moment before fading away into the quiet. We continue our walk and come across an ornate cast iron park bench. Its curved legs and wooden slats are completely covered in a beautiful, feathery pattern of ice crystals. They look like tiny, intricate ferns, a work of art painted by the cold night itself. To touch it would be to feel an intense, piercing cold. The low winter sun is rising now, and it casts long, gentle, blue shadows across the pristine, untouched snow that covers the open fields. The light is brilliant, almost dazzling, as it reflects off the millions of tiny ice crystals. The world seems to be made of light and shadow. The silence is broken by a single new sound. It is the song of another bird, hidden in the frosted branches. Its simple, clear melody is the only music in this sleeping, frozen world. And we feel a sense of profound peace, of solitude, of being the only one awake in a world that has been transformed into something new and magical. And here, our journey comes to a gentle close. Our walk through the Victorian winter is over. The gas lamps have been extinguished, the fire has burned down to soft, glowing embers, and the city is asleep under a thick, silent blanket of snow. The struggles and triumphs of that time now belong to history, and all that is left is the quiet peace of this moment. Thank you for joining me on this journey tonight. It is always a privilege to share these stories with you. Your presence and support make this channel a wonderfully warm and welcoming place. May your own world be comfortable and safe, and may your sleep be deep and undisturbed. Rest well.